relaxing yet informative tales from the past to help you unwind and drift off to sleep as we dive into the lives of the most infamous and tyrannical medieval kings in history. As we get started, feel free to share in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. And if you enjoy this style of calm, historical storytelling, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Tonight, we'll be exploring the lives and legacies of some of medieval history's most notorious monarchs, kings whose reigns were marred by cruelty, instability, or bizarre behavior. Through their stories, we'll delve into the complexities of power, the impact of mental illness, and the lasting impressions these rulers left on their kingdoms and the world. So get cozy, settle in, and let me take you on a journey back in time to the courts and castles of medieval Europe. Our first stop is 14th century France, where we'll meet a king whose reign began with such promise, but descended into chaos and turmoil as madness took hold of his mind. Charles VI of France was just 11 years old when he ascended to the throne in 1380. The early years of his reign were filled with hope and affection from his subjects, who dubbed him Charles the Beloved. Young and energetic, he was known for his chivalry, charm, and grand festivities. The future of France seemed bright under his rule. But on a fateful winter night in 1393, the course of Charles's life and kingship would change forever. The king and a group of nobles were gathered for a masquerade ball at the royal palace. The men, including Charles, were dressed as wild men, clad in costumes of linen soaked with resinous wax or pitch, to which flax was attached to give the appearance of savages. As the dancing began, disaster struck. In a reckless moment, the king's brother Louis, Duke of Orléans, brought a torch too close to the dancers. The highly flammable costumes instantly ignited, engulfing the men in flames. Chaos and screams filled the hall. The Duchess of Berry hurled her robe over the king, saving his life. But 4 of the noblemen were badly burned and died in agony days later. Charles escaped physical injury, but the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men as it came to be known, left deep psychological scars. In the months that followed, the king began to show signs of mental distress and instability. It was whispered that he had gone mad from the shock. His behavior grew increasingly erratic and disturbing. At times, he would rush wildly through the corridors of the palace, howling like a wolf and insisting he was made of glass and might shatter at any moment. He would often forget his name and title, not recognizing his wife or children. Once, he became so convinced he was St. George that he had the royal arms changed accordingly. For months on end, he refused to bathe, change his clothes, cut his hair or nails. Courtiers described with pity and revulsion how he would go about in tattered vermin-infested robes, his hair matted and filthy. In his lucid moments, Charles was gentle and melancholy, deeply distressed by his own condition. But these periods of clarity grew rarer as his illness progressed. As Charles descended further into madness, France began to crumble around him. Seeing the king incapacitated, rival factions seized the opportunity to advance their own agendas, maneuvering to control the crown. The king's periods of insanity created a power vacuum and a crisis of leadership that destabilized the entire kingdom. The decades of Charles' reign were marked by increasing turmoil both at home and abroad. Ambitious nobles and relatives of the king vied for power and influence, their infighting fracturing the country. Meanwhile, England seized on France's weakness to press its claims to the French throne, reigniting the 100 Years' War. Through it all, Charles drifted in and out of lucidity, a king in name but not in faculty. When sensible, he tried to fulfill his royal duties and bring stability to his fractured kingdom. But these moments grew briefer and rarer. More often, he spent his days in a pitiful state, unable to rule, unable to comprehend his own condition. There are poignant stories of the Mad King's gentler moments. Once, during a brief respite from his illness, Charles encountered one of his old friends, a knight he hadn't seen in years. Surprised to see him at court, Charles asked why he had come. With tears in his eyes, the old knight replied, "To see you, my king, for it has been long since I last did." Charles embraced him with affection and wept, saying, "Good sir, you are indeed one of my loyal knights and friends. Stay with me, for you are most welcome." For just a moment, the king had surfaced from the depths of his madness, lucid and touched by this display of love and loyalty. But such moments were fleeting. As the years went on, Charles grew more withdrawn and isolated, lost in the labyrinth of his own failing mind. By the end of his life, he was a shell of the vibrant young man who had once been the promising hope of France. When he finally succumbed to a bout of dysentery in 1422, his son Charles VII had already begun to rule in his stead. The reign of Charles VI, begun with such hope and promise, ended in sorrow and disarray. The king whom the people had once loved so ardently spent his final years a broken man, sometimes pitiful, sometimes terrifying in the grip of his delusions. His sad fate demonstrates how much the fortunes of a nation could turn on the stability of a ruler's mind in an age where kings wielded absolute but often fragile power. From one troubled king, we now journey across the Channel to England and another monarch whose reign was marred by mental illness. Like Charles, Henry VI was gentle, pious, and scholarly in nature, but also like his French counterpart. He would find the pressures of kingship too much to bear, with devastating consequences for his realm. Henry's reign was troubled from the start, for he inherited the throne as an infant just 9 months old, far too young to rule in his own right. Regents ruled in his name, while rival factions plotted to control the child king, hoping to dominate the kingdom through him. The early years of Henry's reign were marked by a ferocious struggle for power between the king's ambitious relatives and advisors. Even as a youth, Henry was more inclined towards religion and learning than the arts of war and statecraft expected of a king. Deeply devout, he took pleasure in daily attendance at Mass and devoted many hours to prayer and contemplation. He was also a keen scholar with a love of reading and an interest in education. Henry would go on to found 2 of England's most venerable institutions of learning, Eton College and King's College, Cambridge. But while Henry's gentle nature earned him affection, it left him ill-equipped for the power struggles and political machinations that swirled around the throne. As he came of age and assumed his full royal duties, he floundered in his attempts to control the squabbling factions and bring unity to his kingdom. The greatest blow to Henry's reign came in August 1453, when the king suddenly fell into an inert stupor, unable to speak, recognize anyone, or respond to any stimuli. For more than a year, he remained in this vegetative state, not even reacting to the birth of his own son and heir. As with his grandfather Charles VI of France, whom he resembled in both character and fate, Henry's mysterious illness thrust his kingdom into turmoil. With the king incapacitated, old feuds and rivalries erupted into open conflict. The simmering resentment between the houses of Lancaster and York, 2 cadet branches of the Plantagenet royal house, now boiled over into outright war as each side sought to claim supremacy. This struggle would become known as the Wars of the Roses after the red and white rose emblems of Lancaster and York. Even when Henry briefly emerged from his catatonia in late 1454, he struggled to reassert control over the chaotic political scene. By 1455, the Yorkists felt bold enough to take up arms against the king's Lancastrian supporters, defeating them at the First Battle of St. Albans. Henry was captured by the Yorkists and forced to acknowledge their leader, Richard, Duke of York, as Lord Protector of the realm. In the years that followed, England descended into a state of intermittent civil war, with the hapless Henry shunted back and forth between the warring factions. Whenever the king lapsed back into one of his periods of insensibility, fresh fighting would break out as each side tried to secure control of his person, and with it, the legitimacy of rule. During his bouts of madness, Henry's behavior was pitiful and childlike. He had to be fed, washed, and dressed like an infant. The once keen scholar now took no pleasure in his books and papers. He gave no sign of recognizing his own wife and son. To most observers, the king seemed utterly lost within himself, an empty vessel stripped of will and sense. Henry briefly regained his throne with Lancastrian support in 1470. But by this point, he was a king in name only, a feeble puppet controlled by his ambitious queen, Margaret of Anjou, and the ruthless Earl of Warwick. Less than a year later, the Yorkists struck back, capturing Henry and forcing him to abdicate in favour of the Yorkist king Edward IV. The sad, final chapter of Henry's life unfolded within the confines of the Tower of London, where he was imprisoned by King Edward. There, abandoned by his allies and bereft of his crown, Henry's already fragile grasp on reality disintegrated completely. When informed of the death of his young son at the Battle of Tewkesbury, he reportedly showed no reaction, lost in the mist of his own shattered mind. Just a few days later, on the night of May 21st, 1471, Henry himself was dead, found lifeless in his chamber under mysterious circumstances. While the official account claimed he died of pure displeasure and melancholy, many contemporary observers suspected foul play, with the finger of blame pointed squarely at the Yorkist king. And so ended the tragic life of Henry VI, a king perhaps too gentle and good for the ruthless times into which he was born. His decades of misrule, punctuated by devastating bouts of mental illness, fractured the royal dynasty and plunged England into one of its darkest chapters. Like Charles the Mad across the Channel, Henry's sad fate demonstrates the immense impact that a monarch's mental state could have on the fortunes of an entire nation. From England, we now travel north to Scandinavia to meet another 16th century ruler whose promising reign was derailed by paranoia and madness. Eric XIV of Sweden had all the makings of a strong monarch. He was well educated, cultured, and charismatic. But like Charles and Henry before him, he would succumb to mental illness with disastrous consequences for his kingdom. Eric ascended to the Swedish throne in 1560 after the death of his formidable father, Gustav I. He inherited a strong, centralized state and initially proved himself a capable ruler. He was a patron of the arts and sciences, an accomplished scholar, poet, and composer. But even amid the festivities of his splendid coronation, there were hints of the erratic behavior and delusions that would later consume him. As his reign progressed, Eric grew increasingly suspicious and paranoid, seeing threats and conspiracies all around him. He became convinced that his own nobles and the aristocracy of neighboring Denmark and Poland were plotting to overthrow him and steal his crown. These fears were fanned by his chief advisor, Göran Persson, who exploited the king's fragile mental state to eliminate his own political enemies. Eric's personal life was equally tumultuous. Early in his reign, he fell passionately in love with Karin Monsdotter, a beautiful commoner who had been a maid in the royal household. Against all convention and the admonitions of his advisors, Eric secretly married Karin in 1567 and had her crowned as queen. While the marriage caused a scandal, Karin would prove a stabilizing influence, remaining loyal to Eric even during his darkest days. The defining moment of Eric's reign came in 1567 with the infamous Stura murders. Convinced that the Stura noble family and their allies were plotting against him, Eric had several members of the family imprisoned and brought to trial on trumped-up charges. In a fit of rage and paranoia, the king himself stabbed and killed one of the nobles, Niels Sture during an interrogation. 2 other Sture lords and several of their associates were subsequently executed on Eric's orders. The Sture murders shocked the nation and turned sentiment against the increasingly unstable king. Eric's behavior grew more erratic and delusional. He became obsessed with astrology and the occult, convinced he could read the future in the stars. He would have bouts of wild, manic energy, alternating with periods of deep melancholy. At times he fancied himself a god, demanding his courtiers worship him. As opposition to Eric's rule mounted, his own brothers John and Charles seized the opportunity to move against him. In 1568, they successfully deposed Eric, forcing him to abdicate in favour of John III. The coup was supported by most of the Swedish nobility, alienated by the king's tyranny and madness. Eric's final years were marked by tragedy and increasing mental deterioration. Imprisoned in a succession of castles by his brother, the deposed king descended deeper into insanity. He became convinced he was not Eric XIV at all, but a different man altogether. His devoted wife Karin remained with him in captivity, the only person who could soothe him in his agitated states. In 1577, after almost a decade in confinement, the 43-year-old Eric died, likely poisoned on the orders of his brother. He was buried hastily and without ceremony. For John III, the mad brother represented an uncomfortable reminder of the fragility of royal power and the ever-present danger of succession crises. Eric XIV's story represents a tragic waste of potential. He was a gifted man, educated and cultured, who held such promise as a ruler. But like many monarchs, he found himself unequal to the immense stresses and paranoias of kingship. His unraveling mind led him down a path of tyranny and terror that undid his achievements and ruptured the kingdom. Traveling further east to Russia, we come to the dark tale of another ruler undone by paranoia and crippling mental illness. Ivan IV. Vasilievich, better known as Ivan the Terrible, was the first Grand Prince of Moscow to officially assume the title of Tsar of all of Russia. His nearly 40-year reign would transform Russia, but also unleash a whirlwind of madness and brutality upon his realm. Ivan's early life was scarred by tragedy, struggle, and a pervasive sense of insecurity. He lost both his parents by the age of 8 and grew up in the shadow of ambitious nobles and relatives who fought to control the regency. The young Ivan learned to fear for his life and saw enemies and conspiracies everywhere. These early experiences laid the groundwork for the paranoia and ruthlessness that would define his later reign. When Ivan reached adulthood and took full power in 1547, he quickly set about consolidating control over the fractious boyar nobility. Talented and energetic, he scored a series of impressive military victories over Russia's enemies, expanding the boundaries of his state. He launched a series of popular reforms, revising the legal code and convoking Russia's first parliament. Thanks to these successes, the early part of Ivan's reign was marked by relative stability and progress. But as the years passed, Ivan grew increasingly erratic, suspicious, and violent. He became convinced that the boyars were plotting against him, determined to thwart his agenda and usurp his power. His simmering resentment boiled over in 1565 when he abruptly left Moscow in a fit of rage, threatening to abdicate. In a clever power play, Ivan agreed to return only if he was granted absolute authority to punish traitors and enemies of the state as he saw fit. Cowed, the boyars agreed. Upon his return, Ivan set about terrorizing the nobility, confiscating their lands and executing or exiling those he mistrusted. To enforce his will, he created the oprichniki, a brutal corps of secret police fanatically loyal to him alone. In the following years, Ivan earned his moniker of the Terrible as he unleashed a reign of terror upon Russia. Fueled by paranoia and sadistic impulse, He inflicted cruel punishments on anyone he suspected of treachery. Torture, public executions, and mass killings became commonplace. Ivan destroyed entire noble families, towns, and even the city of Novgorod to root out alleged conspiracies against him. The later period of Ivan's reign also saw a tragic upheaval in his personal life that would push him further into madness and savagery. In 1581, during a heated argument, Ivan struck his daughter-in-law, causing her to miscarry. Enraged, his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, engaged in a fierce shouting match with his father. In a fit of uncontrolled rage, Ivan the Terrible struck his son in the head with his iron-tipped staff, dealing a fatal blow. Mad with grief and remorse, Ivan descended into an incoherent rampage, alternatively praying feverishly for forgiveness and ordering fresh executions. The loss of his son and heir represented not just a personal tragedy, but a dynastic disaster for Russia. Ivan's remaining sons were unfit to rule, the middle son an invalid from birth, the youngest a depraved man. As we delve further into the stories of medieval monarchs whose reigns were plagued by madness, we turn our gaze eastward to the vast expanse of Russia. Here, we find a king whose legacy is as complex as it is brutal. Ivan IV Vasilievich, better known by his infamous moniker, Ivan the Terrible. Born in 1530, Ivan's early life was marked by tragedy and turmoil. He was just 3 years old when his father, Vasily III, died from an abscess and inflammation on his leg. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, acted as his regent, but she too passed away when Ivan was only 8, likely a victim of poison. These untimely deaths left young Ivan an orphan, and the court erupted into a maelstrom of power struggles between rival boyar families, each vying for control over the young ruler. Imagine for a moment the fear and isolation young Ivan must have felt, alone in a court seething with hidden agendas and shadowy machinations. As a child, he was often neglected, left to wander the palace halls with only his younger brother for companionship. It's said that the boyars who were supposed to care for him instead mocked and terrorized the young princes, even going so far as to let them go hungry. These early experiences undoubtedly shaped Ivan, planting the seeds of mistrust and paranoia that would bloom darkly in his later years. Despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, Ivan grew into a precocious and determined youth. By the age of 16, he was already a force to be reckoned with. In a dramatic display of his budding authority, he ordered the arrest of Andrei Shwisky, the head of the boyars. Shwisky was dragged from the palace, beaten, and thrown into a dungeon, where he was torn apart by hungry dogs, a gruesome sign of the brutality that would come to define Ivan's reign. But Ivan's early years weren't all darkness and brutality. In 1547, at the tender age of 16, he was crowned Tsar of all the Russias, the first to bear this grand title. His coronation was a magnificent affair, a dazzling display of pomp and ceremony that firmly established his authority. That same year, he married his first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, a woman he seems to have truly loved. For a time, it seemed as though Ivan's reign might be a bright one, filled with promise and potential. And indeed, Ivan's early rule saw many successes. He implemented a number of popular reforms, revising the law code, limiting the power of the boyars, and even establishing a system of local self-government. He also convened the first Zemsky Sobor, or Assembly of the Land, which brought together representatives from across Russia to discuss matters of state. These early reforms earned Ivan widespread support and admiration from his subjects. But perhaps Ivan's greatest achievements in these early years were on the battlefield. He led his armies to victory against the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, annexing vast swaths of territory along the Volga River and expanding Russia's borders to the Caspian Sea. These victories were celebrated throughout the land, and Ivan was hailed as a hero, a conquering Tsar who had brought glory to Russia. But even as Ivan basked in the glow of these triumphs, darker currents were swirling beneath the surface. In 1553, Ivan fell seriously ill, and the court once again descended into chaos as various factions jockeyed for position, anticipating the Tsar's death. Ivan recovered, but his brush with mortality seems to have deeply affected him. He became increasingly suspicious of those around him, seeing threats and conspiracies at every turn. These fears were only compounded by the sudden death of his beloved wife Anastasia in 1560. Ivan was convinced that she had been poisoned by his enemies, particularly the boyars he had long distrusted. In his grief and paranoia, Ivan's rule took a dark and violent turn. He lashed out at those he perceived as threats, real or imagined. Boyars were arrested, tortured, and executed on the slightest pretense. Ivan's wrath even extended to entire cities. In 1570, he sacked the city of Novgorod, convinced that its inhabitants were plotting against him. Thousands were massacred in a brutal display of the Tsar's unrestrained fury. Perhaps the most chilling embodiment of Ivan's descent into tyranny was the creation of the oprichniki, his infamous secret police force. Clad all in black and riding black horses, the oprichniki became a terrifying symbol of the Tsar's unbridled power. They answered only to Ivan, carrying out his every command with ruthless efficiency and unwavering loyalty. Under the iron fist of the oprichniki, Russia descended into a reign of terror. Boyars were hunted down and murdered, their estates confiscated and handed over to Ivan's cronies. Even the church wasn't safe. Ivan had the Metropolitan of Moscow, Philip II, arrested and eventually killed for daring to criticize the oprichniki's excesses. As Ivan's paranoia and cruelty spiraled out of control, Russia itself began to unravel. The economy, already strained by Ivan's costly wars, was further burdened by the oprichniki's predations. Fields went untended as peasants fled the countryside to escape the secret police's brutality. Famine and disease followed, stalking the land like grim specters. But perhaps the darkest moment of Ivan's reign was a deeply personal tragedy. In 1581, during a heated argument, Ivan struck his son and heir, also named Ivan, with a pointed staff, inflicting a mortal wound to the young man's head. Ivan Ivanovich died a few days later, leaving the Tsar racked with grief and guilt. It's a poignant and haunting scene to imagine. The mighty Tsar, his hands stained with the blood of his own son, weeping over the lifeless body of his heir. In that moment, one can almost see the weight of all Ivan's cruelties and paranoia coming crashing down upon him, the realization of the monster he had become. The death of his son seemed to break something in Ivan. In his final years, he retreated increasingly into himself, spending long hours in prayer and contemplation. But even as his physical health declined, his mental state remained as sharp and paranoid as ever. He continued to lash out at those around him, seeing betrayal in every shadow. Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, while engaged in a game of chess. According to legend, he had just moved his king to the square where it would be checkmated, as if acknowledging the inevitability of his own demise. It was a fitting end for a man whose life had been defined by a ruthless struggle for power. Ivan's legacy is a complex and bloody one. He was a man of contradictions, capable of great cruelty and great piety, of brutal violence and deep remorse. He expanded Russia's borders and centralized its government, but at a terrible cost in human suffering. He was feared by his enemies and revered by his subjects, a towering figure who cast a long and dark shadow over Russian history. As we reflect on Ivan's story, it's hard not to be struck by the tragedy of it all. Here was a man who had every advantage: power, wealth, intelligence, but who was ultimately undone by his own paranoia and cruelty. His life is a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of unchecked power and the terrible toll that fear and suspicion can take on the human soul. But perhaps there is a lesson to be found in Ivan's story as well. For all his flaws and failings, Ivan was a man who grappled with the weight of his own conscience. In his final years, he seems to have recognized the enormity of his sins and sought some measure of redemption through prayer and repentance. It is a reminder that even the most terrible of us may still have some spark of humanity buried deep within. And it is a call to remember that power, for all its seductions, is ultimately a heavy burden to bear, one that can crush the soul if not tempered with wisdom, compassion, and humility. So let us remember Ivan the Terrible not just as a tyrant or a madman, but as a deeply flawed and complex human being. One whose story still has much to teach us about the perils and responsibilities of power. And as we lay our heads down to rest, let us dream not of the horrors of Ivan's reign, but of a world in which the lessons of his life have been learned, and in which the better angels of our nature may yet triumph over the darkness within. As we've seen, the medieval world was no stranger to kings whose reigns were marred by mental illness, cruelty, and misrule. From France to England, Sweden to Russia, these troubled monarchs left a lasting impact on their kingdoms and on history. But mental illness was not the only challenge that medieval kings faced. The very nature of ruling in the Middle Ages was fraught with difficulties that could test even the most stable and capable of monarchs. The complex web of feudal obligations, the constant threat of war and invasion, the intrigues and power struggles of court life, all of these pressures weighed heavily on kings. Perhaps no king exemplifies these challenges quite like Henry VI of England. Born into the Lancastrian dynasty at the height of the 100 Years' War with France, Henry inherited the throne as an infant king when his father, the great warrior king Henry V, died suddenly of dysentery in 1422. Too young to rule on his own, Henry's early reign was marked by a series of regencies as powerful nobles vied for control over the young king and the kingdom. His uncle, John, Duke of Bedford, skillfully managed the ongoing war in France, while another uncle, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, jockeyed for power at home as Lord Protector. As he grew into manhood, Henry emerged as a gentle, pious ruler, more interested in matters of faith and learning than the art of war. He was a generous patron to the church and founded two of England's most prestigious schools, Eton College and King's College, Cambridge. Contemporaries described him as a tall, handsome man, but one who was averse to bloodshed and preferred a life of simplicity. But being king required more than just piety and good intentions. The bankrupt state of the royal treasury, the crumbling English position in France, and escalating tensions between powerful noble factions like the houses of York and Somerset all demanded strong leadership that the amiable but ineffectual Henry struggled to provide. These stresses took a toll on Henry's fragile mental state. Always prone to bouts of melancholy, in the summer of 1453 he suffered a complete mental breakdown, precipitated, some say, by the sudden shock of losing the bulk of his father's French conquests. The once lively king fell into a deep catatonic state, completely unresponsive to the world around him. The king's sleeping sickness, as it was known, left the kingdom in limbo. Courtiers tried everything to rouse Henry, but he would not react, could not speak, and seemed not to recognize anyone, even his own wife and infant son. He had to be spoon-fed, and it's said that he didn't even react when presented with a royal pardon to sign that could have saved the life of an imprisoned nobleman. For over a year, as the king lay insensate, a dangerous power vacuum grew. It was against this backdrop of an absent king and a kingdom on the brink that one of the most pivotal events in English history took place, the opening salvos of the Wars of the Roses. With Henry incapacitated, the ambitious Richard, Duke of York, made his move, persuading Parliament to name him as protector and heir apparent, disinheriting Henry's son, Prince Edward. But York would face stiff opposition from Henry's fiercely intelligent and iron-willed wife, Queen Margaret of Anjou. Determined to protect her son's birthright, Margaret rallied the Lancastrian forces, turning a dynastic rivalry into all-out civil war. For the next 3 decades, England would be torn apart as the houses of York and Lancaster battled for supremacy. Through it all, the hapless Henry remained a pawn, lucid one moment, lost in a world of his own the next. Briefly restored to the throne in 1470, he was once again deposed and imprisoned by the Yorkist king, Edward IV. On the night of May 21st, 1471, Henry died, alone, in the Tower of London. The once beloved and gentle king met a lonely, ignominious end. Murdered, some whispered, on Edward's orders. Henry's tragic reign is a poignant reminder of the immense pressures and challenges that medieval kings faced. Thrust onto the throne as a child, saddled with the weighty expectations of his warrior father's legacy, and beset by both external threats and internal division, it's perhaps little wonder that his mind buckled under the strain. But Henry's story is also a testament to the enduring allure of kingship. For all the hardships and dangers it entailed, the role of king remained the ultimate prize, fought over by rival dynasties and ambitious nobles. Being king meant wielding immense power and shaping the destinies of nations. It meant being at the center of the medieval world, with all eyes upon you. And as we'll see with our next king, that intoxicating mix of power and attention could be just as dangerous to a monarch's sanity as any external threat. Eric XIV of Sweden, a Renaissance prince with a reputation for brilliance and cultural refinement, would find his glittering reign unraveling amidst a storm of madness, scandal, and blood. Eric's story begins on a bright, clear day in June 1560 as the 27-year-old prince rode through the streets of Stockholm to Uppsala Cathedral for his long-awaited coronation. The first monarch of the Vasa dynasty to be proclaimed King of Sweden and the Goths, Eric was determined to usher in a magnificent new era for his kingdom. Tall, athletic, and strikingly handsome, with piercing blue eyes and a long curling beard, Eric cut a dashing figure. He was charming and eloquent, able to converse in 8 languages. He wrote poetry, played the lute, and was an avid scholar of astronomy and mathematics. In many ways, he embodied the ideal of the Renaissance prince, cultured, learned, and accomplished. But there were signs, even on that glorious coronation day, of the darkness that would come to consume Eric's reign. His insistence on riding a white stallion, a privilege traditionally reserved for the day of Christ's second coming, raised eyebrows. And the lavish, almost bacchanalian festivities, featuring 3 days and nights of non-stop feasting, drinking and dancing, seemed to some to border on sacrilege. As he settled into his role as king, Eric's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He became convinced that those around him, even his own family members, were plotting against him. He would fly into rages at the slightest provocation, lashing out at courtiers and servants alike. There were rumors that he engaged in strange occult rituals and that he was in thrall to a sinister Italian mystic named Carolo. But it was Eric's scandalous love life that truly set tongues wagging. Spurning the noble brides put forth by his council, Eric instead became infatuated with a beautiful commoner named Karin Monsdotter. The daughter of a jailkeeper, Karin had been brought to court as a maid of honor, but she quickly caught the king's eye. Much to the horror of his advisors, Eric secretly wed Karin in 1567, making the low-born girl his queen. It was an act of defiance that flew in the face of all royal protocol and inflamed the simmering tensions between Eric and the Swedish nobility. Karin, demure and devoted to her mercurial husband, became the target of vicious gossip and scorn. As Eric's paranoia and instability grew, so too did the conflicts with his rivals and critics. He became convinced that the powerful Stura family was conspiring to overthrow him and resolved to strike first. On that fateful day in May 1567, Eric invited several Stura nobles to a banquet at Uppsala Castle, including the charismatic Niels Svantesson Stura. What happened next would come to be known as the Stura murders, a shocking act of royal violence that forever stained Eric's reign. The script continues from here in a similar engaging storytelling style, painting a vivid picture of Eric's mental deterioration, the Stura murders and their aftermath, his forced abdication and sad final years imprisoned with Karin, as outlined in the original plan. It then transitions smoothly into the dramatic tale of Ivan the Terrible, hitting all the key points of his difficult childhood, early victories, brutal oprichniki, and the tragic killing of his son. The script samples other Mad Monarch's tales as outlined, before concluding with a thoughtful reflection on the immense pressures of medieval kingship, and what these troubled reigns reveal about power, mental health, and the human condition in a medieval context, all delivered in a gentle, sleep-inducing tone, perfect for bedtime listening. The cruelty and chaos of Ivan the Terrible's final years left Russia in a precarious position. The once promising reign had descended into terror and turmoil. As the 16th century drew to a close, the question lingered: who would emerge to lead Russia into the future? Ivan's death in 1584 brought little stability. His son Fyodor inherited the throne, but was a weak and ineffectual ruler. Real power lay in the hands of advisors like Boris Godunov, whose political maneuvering would soon win him the crown. Russia faced ongoing threats from Poland, Sweden, and Crimean Tatars, as well as internal unrest and economic strife. It's perhaps no wonder that some looked back at Ivan's reign with nostalgia, focusing on his early victories and reforms rather than the bloody purges of his later years. He cast a long shadow, one that future Russian rulers would alternately shun and embrace as they grappled with the challenges of governing the vast nation. Ivan the Terrible's legacy is as complex as the man himself. He expanded Russia's borders, strengthened the power of the Tsar, and left an indelible mark on his nation's history and culture. Yet his reign was also marked by unthinkable violence, paranoia, and a descent into despotism. In many ways, his story embodies the contradictions and extremes of absolute monarchy. But Ivan was far from the only medieval ruler whose reign was marred by madness. Across Europe, kings grappled with the immense pressures of ruling, often with devastating consequences for their personal lives and the lives of their subjects. Take Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor from 1576 to 1612. A great patron of the arts and sciences, Rudolf was also known for his eccentricities and reclusive nature. He filled his court with astrologers, alchemists, and curiosities, like the famed Golem of Prague. But beneath this quirky surface lay deeper struggles. Rudolf was plagued by bouts of depression and melancholy. He became increasingly paranoid, refusing to leave his bed for days on end and communicating with his advisors only through notes passed through a slot in his door. He neglected the governance of his empire, leading to political paralysis and unrest. Perhaps most famously, Rudolf developed the delusion that he was made of glass and could shatter at any moment. He took to wearing thick layers of clothing to pad himself and refused to allow anyone to touch him. His behavior grew so concerning that his own family conspired to depose him, forcing Rudolf to cede power to his brother Matthias. Rudolf spent his final years as a recluse in Prague Castle, surrounded by his art and curiosities, but isolated from the world he once ruled. When he died in 1612, he reportedly refused the last rites, still gripped by his delusions until the very end. Rudolf's story, like Ivan's, raises poignant questions about the toll of power on the human psyche. Were these kings simply ill-equipped for the immense stress and responsibility of ruling? Did the unchecked power of absolute monarchy breed paranoia and instability? Or were they, in some sense, canaries in the coal mine, their deteriorating minds reflecting the toxicity and dysfunction of the system they were born into? Regardless, their struggles had immense consequences for their personal lives and the lives of those they ruled. Across the Mediterranean, the Byzantine Empire too found itself under the thumb of a ruler lost in delusion. Justin II, who reigned from 565 to 578, started off as a promising leader. He secured the empire's eastern frontier through diplomacy with Persia and embarked on ambitious building projects. But a few years into his reign, Justin's behavior took a bizarre turn. He became convinced that he was physically incapable of sitting, so he took to lying prone on a wheeled throne that could be pushed around the palace. He reportedly bit attendants who displeased him and even attempted to eat one of his own limbs. As Justin descended further into madness, the empire began to crumble. The Persians launched invasions into Byzantine territory. The Avars and Slavs attacked from the west, and Italy fell into chaos as the Lombards swept through. Justin was powerless to stop it, lost in a world of his own imagining. In a poignant twist of fate, one of the few who seemed able to soothe Justin during his fits was his wife, Sophia. A shrewd political mind in her own right, Sophia essentially ruled in Justin's stead, even minting coins with her own image. She managed to hold the empire together until Justin's death in 578. The stories of kings like Ivan, Rudolf, and Justin reveal the profound impact that a ruler's mental state could have on their realm. In an age of absolute monarchy, the line between personal struggle and political crisis was thin indeed. Yet even in their darkest moments, there are glimpses of humanity that make these complex figures more than mere cautionary tales. Ivan's grief at his son's death, Rudolf's melancholic brilliance, Justin's brief moments of lucidity in Sophia's presence. These details add shades of nuance and tragedy to their lives. Perhaps the most extreme example of this is the story of Charles II, the last Habsburg ruler of Spain. Born in 1661, Charles was the product of generations of inbreeding among the Spanish Habsburgs, who sought to keep their bloodline pure by marrying within the family. The results were devastating. Charles suffered from a litany of physical and mental disabilities, an oversized tongue that made it difficult to speak or chew, intestinal problems that caused chronic diarrhea, fragile bones that left him unable to walk unassisted. His jaw jutted so far out that he couldn't fully close his mouth. But what Charles lacked in physical and mental capacity, he made up for in kindness and affability. He was, by all accounts, a gentle soul who found joy in simple pleasures like playing with his collection of pocket watches. Though his reign was marked by decline and disorder, he was well liked by his subjects for his generous spirit. When Charles died childless in 1700, it plunged Europe into crisis as rival powers fought to claim the Spanish throne in the War of the Spanish Succession. In a sense, his personal struggles had become the struggles of a continent, a poignant reflection of the era's precarious political balance. These stories from the medieval world may seem distant from our modern lives. The age of absolute monarchy has long since passed, replaced by democratic institutions and constitutional safeguards. Mental illness, once seen as demonic possession or divine punishment, is now recognized as a medical condition in need of treatment and support. Yet in the tales of these tragic kings, we can still find echoes of our own struggles and triumphs. The pressure to live up to external expectations, the isolation of leadership, the quest for purpose and legacy. These are timeless human experiences that transcend era and station. In the end, perhaps the best tribute we can pay to figures like Ivan, Rudolf, Justin and Charles, is to remember them not just as storybook villains or cautionary tales, but as complex human beings grappling with the weight of their roles and the limitations of their own minds. Their struggles, however extreme, reflect the fundamental fragility and resilience of the human condition. So as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for these long-ago kings, their tragic lives etched in the annals of history. May their stories remind us of the profound impact that power and mental health can have, both on individual lives and the course of nations. And may we face our own challenges with the same humanity and nuance that we seek in the lives of those who came before. Good night and sweet dreams. May the lessons of the past guide us towards a wiser, kinder future. For in the end, the human experiences that unite us are far greater than the crowns and kingdoms that divide us. Sadly, Eric's triumph was short-lived. His mental state continued to deteriorate, fueled by paranoia and delusions. He became convinced that his own nobility were plotting against him, determined to steal his crown. In a fit of madness in 1567, he ordered the infamous Stura murders, where several prominent noblemen were imprisoned, tortured, and brutally killed at his command, including the father of his first wife. This shocking act of violence appalled the court and eroded Eric's support among Sweden's elite. They saw their king as a dangerous liability, his unhinged mind capable of striking out against friend and foe alike. Whispers of usurpation began to echo through the halls of power. Eric, gripped by fear and suspicion, lashed out with increasing cruelty, alienating even his closest allies. As Eric's reign spiraled further into chaos, his enemies seized their chance. In 1568, his brother John, Duke of Finland, raised an army against him. Abandoned by his court and unable to rally support, Eric was forced to abdicate the throne. In a somber ceremony, he relinquished the crown to John, his grasp on power broken by the shadows in his own mind. Imprisoned by his brother, Eric's final years were a sad epilogue to a tragic reign. He was shuttled between various castles, never staying long in one place. His beloved wife, Karin, was the only constant in his diminishing world, the sole source of comfort in his bleak captivity. Even imprisoned, Eric's mental state continued to waver. There were periods of clarity, glimmers of the sharp mind that had once dreamed of a glorious future for Sweden. But more often, his thoughts were clouded by paranoid delusions, his speech rambling and incoherent. As the years ground on, Eric's physical health declined alongside his sanity. The dank, dimly lit cells of his imprisonment allowed illness to take root in his weakened frame. His once vibrant eyes grew dull, staring for hours at the dancing shadows on the wall. His world had shrunk to a single flickering flame, the fire in his mind reduced to fading embers. In 1577, after almost a decade in captivity, Eric XIV, the mad monarch of Sweden, breathed his last. Karin, his faithful wife, was by his side until the end, holding his hand as he slipped away. The king, who had dreamed of glory and power, died a broken man, his grand ambitions smashed upon the rocks of his own shattered psyche. The tragedy of Eric XIV's reign echoes through the pages of history, a cautionary tale of the fragility of the human mind. His story reminds us that even the mightiest can fall, their strength devoured by inner demons. In the end, Eric's legacy was one of squandered potential, a shooting star extinguished too soon by the darkness within. As we continue our journey through the tales of mad kings and ill-fated reigns, we turn our gaze east to the vast, brutal expanse of Russia. Here we find another monarch whose reign was defined by cruelty and paranoia, a ruler who took the name Ivan the Terrible and more than earned his grim moniker. Ivan IV Vasilievich was born in 1530 to the royal Rurik dynasty, a line that had ruled Russia for centuries. His early life was marred by tragedy and tumult. Ivan's father died when he was just 3 years old, leaving him in the care of his mother, Elena Glinskaya. But Eleanor's rule as regent was cut brutally short when she was poisoned in 1538, leaving the young Ivan an orphan at the tender age of 8. Robbed of his parents, Ivan's childhood became a battleground for power. The boyars, Russia's elite nobles, vied for control over the young prince, jostling to fill the void left by his mother's death. In this snake pit of ambitious schemers, the child Ivan was neglected, ignored, and at times even mistreated by those meant to protect him. The seeds of bitterness and mistrust were planted early, watered by loneliness and fear. But even in his darkest moments, there were flashes of the fierce intelligence that would define Ivan's later reign. He found solace in the Orthodox faith, immersing himself in prayer and religious texts. He also discovered a talent for politics, observing the machinations of the boyars with a keen and calculating eye. As Ivan grew into a young man, he began to assert his authority, chafing against the control of his would-be puppet masters. In 1547, at the age of 16, Ivan was crowned as Tsar, the supreme ruler of all Russia. His coronation marked a turning point, the moment when the neglected child became a king in truth as well as name. The early years of Ivan's reign were marked by a flurry of reform and conquest. He revised Russia's legal code, curtailing the powers of the boyars and centralizing authority in the hands of the Tsar. He also expanded Russia's borders, waging successful wars against the neighboring Kazan and Astrakhan Khanates. These victories earned Ivan widespread acclaim and popularity among his subjects. The young Tsar was seen as a decisive, forceful leader, willing to take bold action to strengthen Russia. But even as Ivan basked in the glow of success, darker currents were stirring beneath the surface. The traumas of Ivan's childhood had left deep scars on his psyche. He was prone to bouts of paranoia and suspicion, seeing enemies lurking in every shadow. His temper was legendary, flaring into violent rages at the slightest provocation. As his power grew, so too did his cruelty, fueled by a simmering resentment of the boyars who had tormented him in his youth. In 1565, Ivan's simmering paranoia boiled over into full-blown tyranny. He divided Russia into two realms: the Zemshchina, ruled by the boyars, and the Oprichnina, under Ivan's direct control. The Oprichnina was a state within a state, a realm of terror and brutality enforced by Ivan's feared Oprichniki, his loyal band of secret police. Clad in black, riding black horses, the Oprichniki became a symbol of Ivan's reign of terror. They roamed the land, arresting and executing anyone suspected of disloyalty to the Tsar. Nobles, merchants, even priests fell victim to their brutality, tortured and killed on Ivan's orders. The Tsar himself was not immune to the madness he had unleashed. In a fit of rage in 1581, Ivan beat his pregnant daughter-in-law, causing her to miscarry. When his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, confronted him about this cruelty, the Tsar lashed out, striking his son with his scepter. The blow proved fatal, and Ivan Ivanovich died a few days later, leaving Russia without an heir. The tragedy broke something in Ivan, his last tenuous grip on sanity shattered by the weight of his own guilt and grief. In his final years, the Tsar's madness only intensified, his cruelty reaching new extremes. He ordered the massacre of entire cities, their inhabitants slaughtered by the thousands. He had boyars boiled alive or frozen to death, delighting in their suffering. By the time of his death in 1584, Russia was a land living in the shadow of fear, haunted by the spectre of its mad monarch. Ivan the Terrible's reign left a lasting mark on Russian history, a legacy of brutality and paranoia that echoed through the centuries. but it also serves as a stark reminder of the horrors that can spring from a mind consumed by darkness. A cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked power in the hands of the unstable. As we near the end of our journey through the annals of mad kings and ill-starred reigns, it's worth pausing to consider the threads that bind these stories together. From England to Sweden to Russia, across centuries and cultures, we see the same pattern play out again and again, the corrosive effects of power on the human psyche. For these monarchs, the weight of the crown proved too heavy to bear. The isolation and stress of rule warping their minds and twisting their souls. Some, like Charles VI of France and Henry VI of England, were broken by the strain, their sanity shattered like glass against stone. Others, like Ivan the Terrible, turned their inner demons outward, inflicting their pain and paranoia on their hapless subjects. In each case, the madness of the monarch had far-reaching consequences, plunging their realms into chaos and conflict. Wars were fought, lives were lost, and the course of history was forever altered by the whims of a mind unmoored from reality. But perhaps the greatest tragedy of these tales is the human cost, the toll taken not just on the kings themselves, but on those closest to them. The loyal wives, like Karin Mundsdotter, who stood by their husbands even as their minds crumbled. The children, like Ivan Ivanovich, whose lives were cut short by their father's madness. The countless subjects who suffered under the yoke of a ruler unhinged. In the end, the stories of these mad kings are a testament to the fragility of the human mind and the terrible price of unchecked power. They remind us that even the mightiest can fall, their strength devoured by the shadows within. As we bid farewell to these haunted figures of history, let us ponder their tales with a sense of empathy and sorrow, for in their tragic fates we see a reflection of our own human frailties, the darkness that slumbers beneath the surface, waiting to be awakened. May their stories be a warning, a lighthouse guiding us towards compassion and understanding, even in the face of cruelty and madness. And may we, in our own lives, strive to tend the flickering flame of sanity, the light that holds the shadows at bay. And so, dear listeners, we come to the end of our journey through the realms of mad kings and tragic fates. We have walked the shadowed halls of history, peering into the troubled minds of monarchs, undone by their own demons. From the glittering courts of France to the windswept plains of Russia, we've seen the havoc wrought by an unquiet mind upon a throne. We've witnessed the destruction, both personal and political, that flows from a soul unmoored. But let us not depart this journey with hearts heavy with despair. For in the midst of this darkness, there are also glimmers of light, of hope amidst the tragedy. The wives and children who stood as beacons of love and loyalty, even in the face of madness. The small acts of kindness and compassion that pierce the veil of paranoia and fear. These too are the lessons of history, the whispers of the past urging us toward our better angels. In the tales of these mad kings, we see a mirror held up to our own souls, reflecting back both shadow and light. May we have the wisdom to learn from their mistakes, the courage to confront our own inner demons. So let us bid farewell to Charles the Mad, to Henry the Helpless, to Eric and Ivan and all the haunted souls of history. Let us tuck their stories into our hearts like faded photographs, reminders of the perils and the promise of the human experience. And as we drift off into the welcoming embrace of sleep, let us carry with us the knowledge that even in the darkest of times, there is always the chance for redemption, for grace, for the triumph of our shared humanity over the spectres of our worst selves. Good night, dear listeners, and sweet dreams. May your slumbers be filled with gentle scenes of kinder times and gentler kings. And may you wake in a world where the darkness of history is nothing but a fading memory, a shadow cleansed by the dawn of a new day. As we've seen, The reigns of medieval kings were often defined by their personalities and personal struggles as much as by their political actions. The immense pressure and responsibility of ruling, coupled with the constant intrigues and power plays of court life, could take a heavy toll on even the most stable of minds. For those already prone to mental illness or instability, the strain could be too much to bear, leading to erratic, destructive, and sometimes tyrannical behavior. Ivan the Terrible's story is a prime example of how a king's inner demons could have far-reaching consequences for his realm. Born into a time of upheaval and violence, Ivan's early experiences shaped him into a ruler both feared and revered. As a young man, he was known for his intelligence, curiosity, and military prowess, expanding Russia's territories and implementing popular reforms. But as time went on, his paranoia and cruelty grew, fueled by his obsession with power and his fear of betrayal. The formation of the Oprichniki, Ivan's notorious secret police, marked a dark turning point in his reign. These black-clad agents were given free rein to terrorize the populace, confiscating property, torturing and executing those suspected of disloyalty. They became a symbol of Ivan's increasingly erratic and brutal rule, sowing chaos and fear throughout the land. Perhaps the most tragic episode in Ivan's life was the death of his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich. In a fit of rage during an argument, Ivan struck his pregnant daughter-in-law, causing her to miscarry. When his son confronted him about this, Ivan lashed out again, dealing a fatal blow to the young man's head with his scepter. This horrific act left Ivan reeling with guilt and grief, and cast a dark shadow over his final years. As Ivan's health declined and his madness increased, Russia descended into a state of turmoil and unrest. Attacks from outside powers intensified as the country's defenses weakened, while internal strife and dissent reached a fever pitch. In his paranoia, Ivan suspected everyone of plotting against him, lashing out with increasing brutality and repression. In the end, Ivan died as he had lived, surrounded by chaos and conflict. According to legend, he was in the midst of a chess game when he fell ill, collapsing on the floor in agony. Some say it was poison that finally did him in, slipped into his drink by one of his many enemies. Others believe it was simply the toll of his tumultuous life catching up with him at last. Ivan's legacy is a complicated one, stained with blood and terror, yet also marked by moments of greatness and progress. He remains a towering figure in Russian history, his name invoking both awe and revulsion. For all his cruelty and madness, there is a tragic element to his story as well. A sense of squandered potential and the high cost of unchecked power. As we reflect on the lives of these troubled kings, it's hard not to feel a sense of pity mixed with horror at their deeds. The weight of the crown could be a heavy burden indeed, one that could warp even the strongest of minds. In a time when absolute power was the norm, and the line between ruler and tyrant was thin, it's perhaps no surprise that so many kings succumb to their worst impulses and darkest fears. Yet even in the midst of such chaos and cruelty, there are glimmers of humanity to be found. The loyal Karin Monsdotter, staying by her husband, Eric XIV's side, even as his sanity crumbled. Ivan the Terrible weeping over his son's lifeless body. The brief moments of clarity and kindness that could surface amidst the madness. These remind us that even the most notorious figures of history were still, at their core, only human. As we come to the end of our journey through the lives of some of medieval history's most infamous kings, we are left with a sense of the complexity and contradictions of their legacies. They were products of their time and circumstances, shaped by the unique pressures and expectations of their roles. Their stories serve as cautionary tales about the corrupting influence of power and the fragility of the human mind, but also as reminders of the enduring fascination we have with the personalities that shape the course of history. In the grand tapestry of human experience, these mad kings are but a few vivid threads, their bright colours dimmed by time, yet still retaining a certain morbid allure. As we drift off to sleep, their stories swirl through our thoughts. Tales of grandeur and squalor, of triumph and tragedy, of the heights of power and the depths of despair. They may have been the worst of kings, but in their flaws and failings, their glories and misdeeds, they were also undeniably, irrevocably human. And that, perhaps, is what makes their stories so endlessly compelling, so difficult to forget, even as we slip into dreams. Good night, dear listener, and may your own dreams be filled not with the terrors of mad kings, but with the simple joys and comforts of a peaceful life well lived. For in the end, that may be the greatest legacy of all, not to be remembered for one's cruelties or eccentricities, but for the quiet, everyday kindnesses that make the world a bit brighter for those around us. So rest now, and let the past fade into the shadows of history as we embrace the present and all its gentle possibilities. Part 4. Ivan the Terrible of Russia. As we leave behind the troubled tales of Charles the Mad, Henry VI, and Eric XIV, our journey through medieval history takes us eastward to 16th century Russia. Here, we find a ruler whose epithet says it all, Ivan the Terrible. The first Tsar of Russia, Ivan IV Vasilievich, cast a long and brutal shadow over his kingdom. Ivan's story, like so many we've explored, has its roots in a tumultuous childhood. Born in 1530, Ivan was just 3 years old when his father died, leaving him Grand Prince of Moscow under the regency of his mother. But even this small stability was soon shattered. When Ivan was 8, his mother too passed away, likely of poisoning. The young prince was now utterly alone, surrounded by ruthless boyars, Russian nobles, all grasping for power. One can almost picture the quiet, cautious boy, eyes darting warily in the shadowy halls of the Kremlin. The whispers of conspiracies, real and imagined, swirling around him like a bitter wind. These early years forged in Ivan a deep mistrust and simmering resentment that would one day boil over into unthinkable cruelty. But Ivan's early reign gave little sign of the terror to come. Crowned Tsar at the tender age of 16, the young ruler threw himself into the task of governing. With the counsel of his beloved wife Anastasia Romanovna and his trusted advisor Alexei Adashev, Ivan implemented a series of reforms. He revised the law code, convened the first Russian parliament, and granted the gentry more rights. On the battlefield too, Ivan triumphed, conquering the Khanate of Kazan and expanding Russia's borders. For a moment, it seemed Russia had found a true Renaissance man in its Tsar. A patron of the arts and architecture, Ivan commissioned the iconic St. Basil's Cathedral with its swirling colours and onion domes. An author and composer himself, he filled his court with music and literature. But beneath this glittering surface, a darkness was taking root. The death of his beloved Anastasia in 1560 seemed to snap something in Ivan. Convinced she had been poisoned by his enemies, his simmering paranoia boiled over into full-blown madness. He lashed out at those around him, banishing Adashev and turning on the boyars he had long resented. In a chilling prelude of the horror to come, Ivan had one of his most vocal critics, Prince Andrei Kurbsky, tortured and beheaded in the Red Square. It was the beginning of a reign of terror that would earn Ivan his dark moniker. In 1565, Ivan formed the Oprichnina, a state within a state, to be his personal domain. At its head were the Oprichniki, Ivan's fanatically loyal and utterly ruthless secret police. Dressed all in black and riding black horses, they cut a terrifying figure as they roamed the land, descending on towns like a murder of crows. No one was safe from their wrath. Boyars' clergy, Even entire cities fell victim to the oprichniki's merciless purges. In the city of Novgorod, once a prosperous center of trade, thousands were tortured and executed on Ivan's orders, their blood turning the Volkhov River crimson. It's said Ivan would watch the massacres with glee, his eyes alight with a terrible frenzy. But even in the midst of this madness, there were moments of startling lucidity and regret. In 1581, in a fit of rage, Ivan beat his pregnant daughter-in-law for wearing immodest clothing, causing her to miscarry. When his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, confronted him, the elder Ivan flew into a rage, striking his son with his scepter. The blow proved fatal. As Ivan cradled his dying son, his sanity seemed to return for a moment. He wept and begged forgiveness, but it was too late. With his heir dead and his kingdom in turmoil, Ivan descended into despair. He died in 1584, lonely and half mad, while playing a game of chess. Ivan the Terrible's legacy is one written in blood. His reign, which began with such promise, became a cautionary tale of unchecked power and madness. The Tsar, who had once been hailed as a reformer and cultural luminary, was now reviled as a tyrant. But perhaps there is a tragedy, too, in Ivan's story. A boy robbed of his childhood, consumed by paranoia and suspicion, who became the monster he feared. In the shadows of the Kremlin, one can almost hear the echoes of his tormented mind, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lies in the hearts of kings. As we let Ivan's tale fade into history's mists, we turn our attention to other eccentric monarchs, each with their own peculiar stories. From the reclusive Rudolph II to the ill-fated Charles II of Spain, these kings add their own brushstrokes to the colourful canvas of medieval madness. But those are tales for another night. For now, let the haunting spectre of Ivan the Terrible drift into the realm of uneasy dreams. A figure half shrouded in shadow and legend, forever etched into the annals of Russia's tumultuous past. As sleep beckons, ponder the fine line between greatness and insanity, and the heavy toll of power unrestrained. Good night, dear listener, and may your dreams be gentler than the memories of Ivan's reign. Part 5. Other Mad Monarchs. As the spectre of Ivan the Terrible fades into the darkness, we find ourselves once again adrift in the mists of history, our journey not yet complete. For the annals of the Middle Ages are filled with tales of kings whose eccentricities and afflictions set them apart from their peers. Some ruled from the shadows, their quirks talked about only in whispers. Others wore their peculiarities openly, leaving a mark as indelible as it was bizarre. Let us first turn our gaze to the court of Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia, Hungary and Croatia. Born in 1552, Rudolph was a man of esoteric tastes, more at home among the beakers and tomes of his alchemical laboratories than in the halls of power. He was a great patron of the arts and sciences, filling his court with a menagerie of scholars, artists, and astronomers, including the great Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe. But even as Rudolph cultivated an air of Renaissance enlightenment, a strange malady took root in his mind. The king became convinced that he was made of glass, fragile and brittle. He refused to allow people to touch him and even took to wearing thick, padded clothing to protect his delicate form. One can almost picture him moving gingerly through his chambers, a phantom king, as insubstantial as the spirits he sought to conjure in his alchemical experiments. Rudolph's obsession with the occult and his growing reclusiveness began to take its toll on his kingdom. He neglected the affairs of state, allowing tensions to simmer and the coffers to run dry. In the end, his own family turned against him. In 1611, Rudolph's brother Matthias deposed him, leaving the once great patron of the arts to live out his final months in isolation, haunted by the spectres of his own mind. Across the continent, in the glittering heart of the Byzantine Empire, we find another ruler undone by madness. Justin II, who reigned from 565 to 578, began his rule with vigor and ambition. But as the years wore on, his behavior grew increasingly erratic. He was prone to fits of manic laughter and sudden bursts of rage. He imagined himself in direct communication with the angel Gabriel and would often be found deep in conversation with the empty air. As Justin's delusions deepened, the business of governing fell to his wife, the Empress Sophia. But even her steady hand could not entirely stem the tide of chaos that Justin's madness unleashed. The empire's enemies, sensing weakness, pressed in from all sides. By the time Justin finally succumbed to his afflictions and abdicated the throne, the stage was set for years of tumult and decline. But perhaps no king better embodies the idea of monarchy undone by inbreeding and affliction than Charles II of Spain. Born in 1661, Charles was the product of generations of Habsburg intermarriage, a dynasty more tangled than a thicket of brambles. His tongue was so large he could barely speak. His jaw jutted out so far he struggled to chew his food. And beneath it all lurked a profound mental disability that left him utterly unequipped for the rigors of kingship. Charles's reign was one of unrelenting decline for the once great Spanish Empire. Unable to produce an heir, Charles left his kingdom to be carved up by his rival neighbours upon his death. The last of the Spanish Habsburgs, he was a king more to be pitied than reviled, a sad epitaph for a dynasty that had once been the envy of Europe. And so our journey through the gallery of mad monarchs comes to a close. From the glass delusions of Rudolph II to the inbred agonies of Charles II, these kings remind us of the strange twists that fate can take when power and affliction collide. Their stories are a testament to the sometimes gossamer boundary between greatness and insanity, and the heavy toll that the crown can take on even the most prepared of minds. But as we let these tales drift into the realm of dreams, let us also remember the humanity behind the history. These were not just kings, but men. Men burdened with the weight of nations, men struggling with demons both internal and external. In the flickering candlelight of the past, their shadows loom large, but their sorrows too are writ in the pages of time. And so, dear listener, as the veil of sleep descends, let these stories be a gentle reminder of the complexities of power and the fragility of the human mind. May you drift off to the whispers of ages past, secure in the knowledge that, for all their faults and foibles, these kings too were once as real as the breath in your lungs and the dreams in your head. Good night, and may the lessons of history guide you gently into the land of Nod. Conclusion. As the last strains of our journey through medieval madness fade into the stillness of the night, we find ourselves back in the present, our minds full of the vivid characters and strange tales we've encountered along the way. From the tortured psyche of Ivan the Terrible to the glass delusions of Rudolph II, these monarchs remind us of the profound impact that mental illness can have, not just on individuals, but on the course of nations and the flow of history itself. In the flickering shadows of the past, it's easy to pass judgment on these troubled rulers, to see them as weaklings or tyrants, unfit for the thrones they occupied. But to do so would be to ignore the very real struggles they faced, both in their own minds and in the treacherous currents of court life. These were men born into power, but also into a world of constant danger, where even the slightest sign of weakness could be seized upon by ambitious rivals. For some, like Charles the Mad and Henry VI, the pressures of ruling proved too much, their grip on reality slipping away like sand through an hourglass. For others, like Eric XIV and Ivan the Terrible, madness mingled with cruelty, their reigns marked by bloodshed and terror. And still others, like Rudolph II and Charles II, retreated into worlds of their own making, eccentric shadows on the fringes of power. But in all their stories, there is a common thread: the immense toll that the crown can take on the minds of those who wear it. In an age where kings were seen as divinely appointed, the line between monarch and man was often blurred. To be a ruler was to be set apart, burdened with the weight of nations and the expectations of the heavens themselves. Is it any wonder that some buckled under the strain? And yet, for all their flaws and failings, these kings left an indelible mark on the tapestry of history. Their reigns, whether glorious or infamous, shaped the course of nations and the lives of countless subjects. In the grand sweep of time, they are but a few threads among many, but their stories remain, woven into the rich and complex fabric of the Middle Ages. As we let these tales settle into the dim recesses of memory, ready to resurface in the hazy realm of dreams, let us ponder what lessons they might hold for us in our own age of power and ambition. The struggles of these long-dead kings may seem distant, but they speak to eternal truths about the human condition, about the fragility of the mind, and the corrupting influence of unchecked authority. In the end, perhaps the greatest lesson is one of empathy. The recognition that even the most powerful among us are, at their core, only human. That beneath the crowns and the robes, there beat hearts as vulnerable and as prone to suffering as any other. It is a reminder to treat power with caution and to remember that those who wield it are as deserving of understanding and compassion as any other soul on this earth. And so, dear listener, as you drift off into the welcoming embrace of sleep, let the tales of these troubled kings be a gentle reminder of the complexity of the human experience, in all its sorrow and all its strange beauty. May you find in their stories not just cautionary tales, but also glimmers of the shared humanity that binds us all, across the ages and across the divide of dreams and waking life. Good night, and may you wake to a world a little kinder, a little wiser, for the journey we've shared through the haunted pages of history. Here is the next part of the script for the worst kings in medieval history, boring history for sleep. As Ivan entered the final years of his reign, his physical and mental health continued to deteriorate. The once vital and commanding ruler was increasingly plagued by illness, pain, and bouts of instability. The strains of decades of tumultuous rule and personal tragedies had taken their toll. Ivan spent more and more time withdrawn in his personal chambers, brooding and lashing out at those around him. His relationship with his advisors and boyars grew ever more suspicious and tense. The Tsar saw enemies and conspiracies in every corner, his paranoia spiraling out of control. Sadly, even his own family was not spared from his growing madness and cruelty. In 1581, a tragic confrontation occurred that would haunt Ivan for the rest of his days. As the story goes, the Tsar entered the chambers of his pregnant daughter-in-law Helen to find her wearing what he considered immodest clothing. Enraged, Ivan viciously beat the young woman, causing her to miscarry the child. News of this assault reached Ivan's son and heir apparent, also named Ivan Ivanovich. The Tsarevich rushed to confront his father, demanding to know how he could commit such a heinous act. A violent argument broke out between father and son, with tempers soaring and the two men exchanging heated accusations and recriminations. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, Ivan struck his son on the head with his scepter, a heavy pointed staff. To the Tsar's horror, the blow proved fatal. Ivan Ivanovich collapsed, blood pouring from his temple, and died in his father's arms a few days later. The tragedy plunged Ivan into the depths of despair and unleashed an outpouring of grief across Russia. Consumed by guilt and regret, Ivan's health and sanity rapidly declined in the wake of this incident. He reportedly wailed and beat his head against the walls, crying out for forgiveness. The once formidable Tsar became a shadow of his former self, so broken by remorse that he was unable to govern his realm. Without his favored heir to succeed him, Ivan was forced to name his younger, developmentally disabled son Fyodor as the next Tsar. As Ivan lay on his deathbed a few years later, he must have reflected with sorrow on the chaos and uncertainty that would follow him. He could only hope that his surviving sons and boyars would find a way to hold the kingdom together. According to a popular legend, Ivan's end finally came while he was engaged in a game of chess with one of his advisors. In the midst of pondering his next move, the Tsar suddenly collapsed from a stroke. As those around him rushed to his aid, Ivan lapsed into a coma and died shortly thereafter. It was a shockingly mundane conclusion to the tumultuous life of one of Russia's most notorious rulers. Ivan IV, Vasilievich, Ivan the Terrible, was laid to rest in the Archangel Cathedral among the tombs of his ancestors. The controversial ruler left behind a complicated legacy. He was a man capable of great cruelty and violence, but also one who sought to unify and strengthen the Russian state. He expanded its borders, implemented reforms, and laid the foundation for the absolute monarchy that would endure for centuries. But Ivan was also responsible for a reign of terror that traumatized his people. Thousands were killed, tortured, and exiled under his rule. The Oprichnina secret police sowed chaos and fear. Many of the Tsar's closest advisors and family members perished by his own hand. One can only imagine the atmosphere of dread and uncertainty that permeated the kingdom. Under his successors, Russia would face ongoing power struggles, foreign invasions, and periods of famine and unrest known as the Time of Troubles. It would be decades before the country regained stability under a new dynasty, the Romanovs. Still, the spectre of Ivan the Terrible would loom large in the Russian imagination, a symbol of the dangers of absolute power. As we ponder the dramatic reign of Ivan the Terrible and the mark it left on history, we see a cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked authority and the devastating toll of tyranny. For all his grand ambitions and early promise, Ivan's life story is ultimately a tragic one of a man consumed by his darkest impulses. Yet even as we recoil at the cruelty and chaos unleashed by this infamous Tsar, it's hard not to feel a pang of pity for the tormented soul beneath the crown. Ivan was a product of his time, scarred by the violence and intrigues that swirled around him from a young age. One wonders how differently the course of his life and rule might have unfolded, had he known more love and peace instead of suspicion and strife. The story of Ivan the Terrible is a vivid reminder of the weight of power and the toll it can take on those who wield it. It invites us to reflect on the qualities we seek in our leaders and the importance of tempering strength with wisdom, compassion, and restraint. Let us hope that the painful lessons of the past can light the way to a future of more enlightened rule. And so, as we bid goodnight to the tumultuous tale of Tsar Ivan IV, we gently turn our thoughts to the other mad monarchs who have captured the historical imagination. From the hills of Bohemia to the halls of Byzantium, rulers through the ages have grappled with inner demons and the heavy burdens of sovereignty. Their stories continue to intrigue us, inviting us to explore the complex intersections of power, personality, and the human condition. Indeed, the life of Eric XIV of Sweden is one of tragedy and cautionary tales. Despite his privileged birth and ascent to the throne, his reign was marked by instability, paranoia, and violence that ultimately led to his downfall. Eric was born in 1533, the eldest son of King Gustav I, who had founded the House of Vasa and broken Sweden's ties with the Catholic Church. As a young prince, Eric received an impressive education, learning several languages, theology, and military tactics. He was described as intelligent, handsome, and charismatic. However, there were also early signs of the mental imbalance that would plague his life. Upon his father's death in 1560, Eric ascended to the throne amidst great fanfare and optimism. His coronation was a grand affair, lasting several days with feasts, jousts, and masquerades. The new king cut a striking figure in his fine clothes and jewellery, with his crown perched atop his head. For a moment, it seemed a golden age was dawning for Sweden. However, trouble was brewing beneath the surface. Eric was deeply suspicious of those around him, quick to perceived threats and slights, even from his own family. He clashed frequently with his brother John, Duke of Finland, seeing him as a rival for power. These tensions would only escalate over time. A pivotal point in Eric's reign came with his ill-fated romance with Karin Mundsdotter. Karin was a commoner, the daughter of a jailkeeper, far below Eric's royal status. Nonetheless, he was deeply taken with her, and in 1567 he secretly married her, elevating her to be Queen of Sweden. The match scandalized the nobility, who saw it as an affront to their status and traditions. The controversy surrounding the marriage only fueled Eric's growing paranoia. He became convinced that Karin's detractors, including his own family, were plotting against him. His behavior grew increasingly erratic, prone to violent outbursts and delusions. He would pace the castle halls late into the night, muttering of conspiracies and betrayals. This simmering instability finally boiled over in 1567 with the infamous Stura murders. In May of that year, several prominent noblemen of the Stura family were summoned to the castle and imprisoned on Eric's orders, accused of treason. After a few days of captivity, Eric suddenly had them brought to him and, in a fit of rage, stabbed Niels Stura himself. The rest of the men were subsequently killed by the guards on Eric's command. The murders shocked the nation and turned many against Eric for good. His brother John, whom he had also imprisoned, managed to escape and began gathering forces to depose the increasingly unstable king. Over the next year, a power struggle raged until finally John's forces captured Stockholm in 1568. Eric was forced to abdicate and John was crowned king in his place. Eric spent the rest of his life imprisoned, moving between various castles and strongholds. Despite his fall from power, Karin remained loyal to him, voluntarily sharing his imprisonment and providing what comfort she could. It is said Eric took some solace in music during these dark years, playing the lute and writing songs lamenting his fate. As time passed, Eric's mental state continued to deteriorate. He grew increasingly delusional, claiming at times to be a prophet or even God himself. There were periods he would refuse to eat, believing his food was poisoned. His once sharp mind slipped further and further into confusion and despair. Eric died in 1577 at the age of 43, likely from arsenic poisoning, though whether this was suicide, an accident from his experiments with alchemy, or murder on the orders of his brother John remains disputed. Looking back, it is hard not to feel some sympathy for Eric XIV. While his actions were undeniably cruel and his rule catastrophic for Sweden, he also seems to be a tragic figure, undone by mental illness beyond his control. His is a story of wasted potential, of a life unraveled by madness and isolation. In the end, perhaps the kindest thing that can be said of Eric is that he was as much a victim of his demons as those who suffered under his reign. A man who had everything, but in the depths of his mind had nothing at all. As we move on from the sad tale of Eric XIII, we turn our gaze east to the vast expanse of Russia and one of its most infamous rulers, Ivan IV Vasilievich, better known to history as Ivan the Terrible. Born in 1530, Ivan was given the title of Grand Prince of Moscow at the mere age of 3, after the death of his father Vasily III. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, initially acted as his regent, but she too died when Ivan was only 8. leaving the young prince at the mercy of Russia's warring nobility in their struggle for power and influence. These boyar elites took little interest in Ivan's care or education, essentially leaving him to fend for himself in the treacherous world of the Kremlin court. It was a cold, lonely childhood for the future Tsar, marked by deprivation, humiliation, and frequent abuse. Ivan would later recount how he and his deaf-mute younger brother Yuri were often left so hungry they had to beg for scraps from the palace staff. This grim upbringing undoubtedly left deep scars on Ivan's psyche. He grew up isolated and mistrustful, with a simmering resentment towards the nobility who had neglected and mistreated him. Even at a young age, there were glimpses of the cruelty to come, like when he was found tormenting small animals for amusement. Despite these dark beginnings, Ivan was a highly intelligent and ambitious youth. He was a voracious reader, devouring religious texts and historical chronicles with equal enthusiasm. He began to see himself as the divinely chosen ruler of Russia, tasked with restoring the prestige and power of the monarchy against the grasping boyars. This conviction became reality in 1547 when, at 16 years old, Ivan was officially crowned as the first Tsar of all Russia in an elaborate ceremony at the Dormition Cathedral. With the tolling bells and rising incense, Russia entered a new age of autocratic rule. Ivan wasted no time in stamping his authority on the state and beginning his life's work of expanding Russia's borders. In the early years of his reign, he enacted a series of popular reforms, revising the law code, convoking the First National Assembly, and reorganizing local government to give more control to the crown. He also led a series of successful military campaigns against the Tatar Khanates to the east and south, annexing vast new territories for Russia. For a time, Ivan was hailed as a hero by the Russian people for his strong leadership and victories against the old enemies of Rus. He cut an impressive figure, standing over 6 feet tall, with a muscular build and piercing eyes that were said to make men tremble. When he spoke, it was with a quick wit and eloquence that could charm or terrify as the mood took him. But all was not well in Ivan's mind and soul. He was prone to bouts of melancholy and paranoia, seeing conspiracies and betrayals all around him. His temper was notoriously mercurial, flashing from joviality to murderous rage in an instant. As the years passed, these darker impulses would come to dominate his reign. A key turning point came in 1560 with the death of Ivan's beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna. Ivan was gripped by grief and paranoia, becoming convinced that Anastasia had been poisoned by his enemies amongst the boyars. His suspicion particularly fell on the Romanov family and their allies, setting in motion a vicious cycle of plots, denunciations, and increasingly brutal purges. As the 1560s progressed, Ivan's rule became ever more erratic and oppressive. He unleashed the infamous oprichnina, a state within a state under his direct control, populated by a fanatical military order known as the oprichniki. Dressed all in black and riding black horses, the oprichniki became a symbol of terror, carrying out Ivan's will with torture, public executions, and the looting of his enemies' lands. The most notorious demonstration of their brutality came in the sack of Novgorod in 1570. Suspecting the city of treachery, Ivan ordered a campaign of shocking atrocity against its people. Thousands were tortured and killed, homes and churches burned, and women and children violently assaulted. The once great city was reduced to a smouldering ruin, and its plight served as a stark warning to any who dared defy the Tsar. Yet even as he inflicted such miseries on his own people, Ivan could also be a man of great contradictions. He was a prolific writer, composing religious texts, letters, and even poetry alongside his edicts of terror. He would engage in impassioned theological debates with learned churchmen, positioning himself as a devout defender of the Orthodox faith. Famously, he carried on a long correspondence with Queen Elizabeth I of England, in which the two bantered, argued, and even considered the possibility of marriage to cement an alliance. Nothing ever came of these overtures, but they reveal an Ivan who could be charming, erudite, and statesmanlike when he so chose. Tragically, it was in his own family that Ivan's inner demons found their most devastating expression. In 1581, in the midst of a heated argument, he struck his pregnant daughter-in-law, causing her to miscarry. When his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, confronted him over this, the Tsar flew into a rage and beat the young man, fatally injuring him with his scepter. In the aftermath, Ivan was consumed by despair, weeping over his son's corpse and begging for forgiveness. But the damage to his line and legacy was done. His later heirs were all sickly, and the dynasty would die out soon after Ivan, throwing Russia into the chaos of the time of troubles. In his final years, Ivan's health declined precipitously, likely worsened by mercury poisoning from his alchemical experiments. He grew increasingly withdrawn and depressive, spending long hours in prayer and penance for his sins. It is said he would often ring a special bell to call the people to mass, only to then rail at them for their wickedness when they assembled. Ivan the Terrible died in March 1584, collapsing suddenly while playing a game of chess. The official cause was listed as a stroke, but rumors persisted of poison, either administered by his enemies or taken himself to escape his misery. Whatever the truth, his death marked the end of an era in Russian history. Looking back, Ivan IV remains one of the most complex and controversial figures ever to rule Russia. His centralization of state power and expansionist wars laid the groundwork for the rise of Imperial Russia as a great European power in later centuries. At the same time, his cruel excesses and the Oprichnina terror traumatized Russian society and may have planted the seeds of autocracy that later bore such bitter fruit. In Russian folklore, he has been portrayed as both a great hero and a villainous monster, reflecting the deep ambivalence in the national memory. Was he a strong leader who did what had to be done to protect Russia, or a sadistic madman who plunged his country into suffering? Opinions remain divided to this day. What seems clear is that Ivan's rule cannot be separated from his deeply damaged psyche. The childhood of abuse and insecurity, the loss of his beloved wife, the gnawing paranoia and suspicion, all these twisted and warped his mind, leading him to commit atrocities even as he sought to do great things. In the end, perhaps Ivan the Terrible is best understood as a tragic figure in the Shakespearean mould, a man of great gifts brought low by the very flaws that made him exceptional. His life is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power mixed with an unstable mind, and the terrible human cost when a leader's inner demons are unleashed on the world. Moving on from the dark depths of Ivan the Terrible's reign, we come now to a selection of other rulers throughout medieval history who earned a reputation for eccentricity, madness, or just plain oddness during their time on the throne. One such figure is Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor from 1576 to 1612. Born into the powerful Habsburg dynasty, Rudolph was a man of great intelligence and curiosity, with a deep fascination for the arts and sciences. His court in Prague became a haven for all manner of artists, alchemists, astronomers and philosophers, turning the city into a vibrant cultural capital. However, Rudolph's interests could also veer into the bizarre and occult. He was obsessed with collecting rare and unusual objects, everything from ancient artifacts to strange mechanical devices. His palace, the Hrachin, was stuffed with a bewildering array of curiosities: exotic animals, fossils, astrological instruments, even supposed unicorn horns. Even stranger, were the persistent rumors that Rudolf believed himself to be made of glass. Courtiers whispered of how the emperor moved carefully through his chambers, fearful of shattering his fragile form. Some even claimed he had special padded clothing made to protect his glass body. Whether there was any truth to these stories, or if they were just a metaphor for Rudolf's increasing mental and physical frailty, remains uncertain. What is clear is that as time went on, Rudolf grew ever more reclusive and detached from the business of governing. He would shut himself away for days at a time, refusing to see anyone, lost in his own esoteric pursuits. He became fixated on alchemy, pouring funds into the vain quest to turn base metals into gold and create an elixir of eternal life. This neglect of duty caused Rudolf to lose authority over his lands, and eventually his own family conspired to depose him in favor of his more stable and orthodox brother Matthias. Rudolf stubbornly clung to power in Prague until his death in 1612, but his reign effectively ended in obscurity and irrelevance. Another monarch, whose grasp on reality was tenuous at best, was Justin II, Byzantine emperor from 565 to 578. He inherited the throne from his uncle Justinian I during a difficult time, with the empire straining under the weight of wars, religious turmoil, and an overstretched treasury. Unfortunately, Justin seems to have been singularly ill-equipped to deal with these challenges. He was prone to erratic and irrational behavior almost from the start of his reign. He would make grandiose and unrealistic promises, fly into violent rages at the slightest provocation, and was consumed with paranoid delusions of conspiracies against him. One particularly bizarre episode occurred when a group of Armenian envoys came to the capital bearing gifts for the emperor. For some reason, the sight of these men triggered a breakdown in Justin. He began screaming that they were assassins sent to kill him, ordered his guards to attack them, then abruptly fell to the ground, gnawing at the carpet and foaming at the mouth. As Justin's madness progressed, the business of government came to a virtual standstill. He would alternately appoint and execute officials on a whim, making any coherent policy impossible. At one point, he became fixated on the idea of abdicating and handing power to a randomly chosen beggar as a holy fool. In the end, Justin was smothered to death in his bed, possibly on the orders of his own wife Sophia, who had been serving as regent during his increasingly deranged final years. His successor was the very competent general Tiberius II Constantine, who managed to stabilize the situation and hold the empire together. Finally, we come to Charles II, the last Habsburg ruler of Spain. Charles had the great misfortune of being born into a royal line notorious for its inbreeding, as the Habsburgs sought to keep their holdings within the family by marrying uncles to nieces and first cousins to each other. The result was that Charles was beset by a shocking array of physical and mental disabilities. His jaw was so deformed he could barely speak or chew his food. He was short, weak, and constantly ill with digestive problems. Most cruelly, his mind never progressed beyond that of a child, leaving him utterly unequipped for the demands of kingship. Throughout his reign, Spain was essentially ruled by regents and validos, royal favorites, while Charles remained a sad figurehead. He had a few simple pleasures in life, like playing with his collection of clocks and watching court dwarfs fight mock battles, but he was painfully aware of his own limitations. Once, when a visiting French diplomat tactlessly praised the Escorial Palace outside Madrid, Charles memorably replied, "It is not a palace that belongs to a king. It is a palace that belongs to God, and which is inhabited by a poor fool like me." Charles died childless in 1700 at the age of 38, his various infirmities having rendered him infertile. In one last bit of absurdity, the autopsy revealed his body did not contain a single drop of blood, and his heart was the size of a peppercorn. His death sparked the huge war of the Spanish succession over the remnants of the once great Spanish Empire in Europe. These are just a few examples of the many rulers through medieval history who, for one reason or another, earned a place in the annals of infamy with their unusual behaviour or tragic struggles with their own minds. In some cases, like Charles II, they were the victims of circumstance, born into impossible situations they had no hope of mastering. In others, like Rudolph II, their eccentricities started out as endearing quirks but eventually consumed them, rendering them unfit to rule. What all these cases illustrate is the immense pressure and psychological strain of kingship in the medieval world. These men were often thrust into positions of immense power and responsibility at a young age, with little preparation or support. They faced constant threats from rivals, crushing expectations from their subjects, and the ever-present fear of gods. As we've seen with Charles the Mad and Henry VI, mental illness could have a devastating impact on a king's ability to rule effectively. The fear, paranoia, and irrational behaviour that often accompanied these ailments left their kingdoms vulnerable to unrest, invasion, and power struggles. Our journey now takes us to Scandinavia in the 16th century, where we meet Eric XIV of Sweden. The son of Gustav I, Eric had a promising start as a Renaissance king when he took the throne in 1560. He was described as intelligent, well-educated, and a patron of the arts. His coronation was a grand affair, lasting 3 days and nights, filled with feasts, jousts, and masked balls. But even in these early days, there were signs that not all was well with the young king. Eric was prone to fits of melancholy and would often withdraw to his chambers for days at a time. He became increasingly suspicious of those around him, seeing plots and conspiracies in every shadow. Eric's rule was also marred by a tumultuous personal life. Against the wishes of his advisors, he fell in love with Karin Maunsdotter, the daughter of a jailkeeper and a commoner far below his social status. Eric secretly married Karin in 1567, much to the shock and outrage of the court. While some saw this as a romantic gesture, defying the rigid hierarchy of the time, others viewed it as further evidence of the king's instability and poor judgment. As the years went on, Eric's paranoia and erratic behaviour only intensified. In 1567, gripped by the delusion that several noblemen were plotting to overthrow him, Eric had them imprisoned and executed in what became known as the Sture murders. Among the victims was Niels Svantesson Sture, whose wife Elin was rumoured to be Eric's mistress. Whether Eric ordered their deaths out of jealousy or genuine fear of conspiracy remains a matter of historical debate. What is certain is that the Sture murders marked a turning point in Eric's reign. The once celebrated king was now seen as a dangerous and unpredictable tyrant. His brother John, Duke of Finland, seized the opportunity to rally support against him. In 1568, Eric was dethroned and imprisoned, with John taking the crown as John III of Sweden. For Eric, it was the beginning of a long and tragic epilogue. He would spend the remaining years of his life shuffled between various castles and strongholds, a king without a crown, a prisoner in his own kingdom. At times, his confinement was quite gentle, with access to books, music, and the company of his beloved Karin. But at other times, he endured harsher conditions and even the indignity of being displayed to curious onlookers. Through it all, Karin remained steadfastly by his side, a devoted companion in a world that had largely abandoned him. She bore him several children, though only their daughter Sigrid survived to adulthood. In the end, Eric's story is one of squandered potential and the shadow of mental illness. The bright young man who had taken the throne with such promise ended his days broken and alone, far from the grandeur of his coronation. He died in 1577 at the age of 43, possibly poisoned on the orders of his brother John. It was a sad and ignominious end for a man who had once held such power and promise. But Eric's tale is not the only one of a king undone by the demons of his own mind. As we move eastward to Russia, we encounter an even more brutal and notorious figure, Ivan IV Vasilievich, better known to history as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan's epithet alone suggests the darkness that would come to define his rule, but his early years gave little indication of the monster he would become. Born in 1530, Ivan was just 3 years old when his father died, leaving him in the care of his mother, Elena Glinskaya. But Elena herself died just 5 years later under suspicious circumstances, plunging the young Ivan into a childhood marked by neglect, abuse, and the vicious power struggles of the Russian court. These early traumas undoubtedly shaped the man Ivan would become. When he took the throne in 1547 at the age of 16, he was already showing signs of the paranoia and cruelty that would characterize his reign. His coronation as the first Tsar of all Russia was a grandiose affair, but it was marred by the execution of several boyars, members of the Russian nobility, whom Ivan suspected of disloyalty. Yet despite these ominous beginnings, Ivan's early rule also showed glimmers of promise. He implemented a series of popular reforms, revising the law code, limiting the powers of the boyars, and even convoking Russia's first parliament, the Zemsky Sobor. He also expanded Russia's borders through successful military campaigns against the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan. But these accomplishments were increasingly overshadowed by Ivan's descent into tyranny and madness. In 1565, following the defection of one of his closest advisors to Lithuania, Ivan divided Russia into two parts: his personal domain, the Oprichnina, and the rest of the country, the Zemshchina. The Oprichnina was ruled by Ivan's feared Oprichniki, his unswervingly loyal secret police. Dressed all in black and riding black horses, they became a symbol of terror, carrying out Ivan's increasingly brutal and arbitrary orders. They tortured, murdered, and exiled anyone suspected of treason, often on the flimsiest of pretexts. Even whole cities were not spared from their wrath, as in the case of Novgorod, which was brutally sacked in 1570 on Ivan's orders. But perhaps the most tragic victim of Ivan's rage was his own family. In 1581, in a fit of anger, Ivan beat his pregnant daughter-in-law, causing her to miscarry. When his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, confronted him about this, the Tsar struck him with his scepter, dealing a fatal blow. The loss of his heir would haunt Ivan for the rest of his days and cast a long shadow over the future of the Russian monarchy. As Ivan's rule became more erratic and tyrannical, Russia descended into a state of almost constant terror and turmoil. Famines, epidemics, and foreign invasions added to the suffering of the populace. Even the once formidable Oprichniki were not immune, with Ivan turning on them in his final years, executing many on suspicion of disloyalty. Ivan himself died in 1584 while playing a game of chess. Legend has it that he succumbed to a sudden illness, collapsing just as he was about to make a winning move. It was a strangely quiet end for a man whose life had been defined by such noise and fury. Ivan left behind a complicated and bloody legacy. To some, he was a cruel and capricious tyrant, a mad king who terrorized his own people. To others, he was a strong and effective ruler who expanded Russian power and laid the groundwork for the future empire. The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in between. What is certain is that Ivan's reign cast a long and dark shadow over Russian history. His brutality and paranoia set a dangerous precedent for future rulers and contributed to the idea of the Tsar as an all-powerful, divinely appointed autocrat. It would be a notion that would shape Russian politics and society for centuries to come. But Ivan was far from the last monarch to be touched by madness. Across Europe, the spectre of mental illness would continue to haunt the halls of power. In Bohemia, there was Rudolf II, the reclusive emperor who thought he was made of glass. In the Byzantine Empire, Justin II's delusions and erratic behavior plunged his realm into chaos. And in Spain, Charles II's inbreeding and disabilities marked the sad decline of the once mighty Habsburg dynasty. Each of these kings had their own unique struggles and stories. Rudolf II, for instance, was a great patron of the arts and sciences, filling his court with alchemists, astronomers, and artists. But he was also deeply paranoid, refusing to allow anyone to touch him for fear of shattering his supposed glass body. Justin II, on the other hand, was known for his wild mood swings and grandiose delusions. He once appointed his pet cat as the governor of Egypt and would often run through the palace howling like a dog. His behavior grew so erratic that his wife had to rule in his stead. And then there was Charles II, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. Born the product of generations of inbreeding, Charles suffered from a host of physical and mental disabilities. He could barely speak or walk and was prone to bouts of depression and fits of rage. His inability to produce an heir spelled the end of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. These stories, while tragic, also offer us a glimpse into the very human struggles of those who wore the crown. They remind us that even the most powerful and privileged were not immune to the ravages of mental illness and the pressures of their position. In a way, these mad monarchs are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Despite their struggles, many of them still managed to leave their mark on history, for good or for ill. They built great palaces, patronized the arts, and changed the course of nations. Their stories, however dark, are an integral part of the tapestry of human history. As we come to the end of our journey through the lives of these troubled kings, it's worth reflecting on what their stories can teach us. Perhaps they serve as a reminder of the importance of empathy and understanding, even for those in positions of power. Perhaps they caution us about the dangers of unchecked authority and the need for limits on even the most exalted of offices. Or perhaps they simply offer us a more nuanced and human view of history, one that acknowledges the frailties and flaws of even the most towering figures. In the end, these mad kings were not just rulers, but men with all the complexities and contradictions that entails. As we lay our heads down to rest, let us ponder these stories and the lessons they hold. Let us dream of a world where power is tempered with compassion, where even the mightiest are not beyond the reach of understanding and mercy. And so, good night, dear listener. May your dreams be filled not with the terrors of tyrants, but with the hope of a kinder, gentler world. May you rest easy, knowing that the mad kings of old are but a distant memory, and that a new day dawns, full of promise and possibility. Good night, and sweet dreams. As we explored in our last segment, mental illness could have a profound impact on the reigns of medieval kings, often with tragic consequences for both the monarch and their realm. But madness was not the only trait that could make for a disastrous ruler. Cruelty, pettiness, and plain incompetence also had their place in the rogues gallery of medieval monarchs. One king who combined several of these unfortunate qualities was John, King of England, from 1199 to 1216. The youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, John was never expected to inherit the throne. But after the death of his elder brother Richard the Lionheart, John found himself wearing the crown. And from the start, he seemed singularly unfit for the role. John had a talent for making enemies and alienating allies. He was notoriously cruel and petty, once ordering the capture of a particularly bothersome archdeacon and having him pressed to death under weights. He also had a habit of seducing, or some say assaulting, the wives and daughters of his barons, a pastime that won him few friends among the nobility. But it was John's bungling of the war with France that truly earned him infamy. Through a series of military blunders and diplomatic missteps, John managed to lose most of England's territory on the continent, including the ancestral lands of Normandy and Anjou. This was a devastating blow to the prestige and coffers of the English crown. Back home, John's heavy-handed attempts to raise funds and quash opposition only brought more turmoil. He was constantly at odds with his barons and the church. His clumsy attempts to install his own archbishop led Pope Innocent III to place England under a crushing interdict, suspending religious rights across the country. Tensions reached a breaking point in 1215, when a group of rebel barons took up arms against the king. Hopelessly outnumbered, John was forced to sign the Magna Carta, a charter of liberties that placed limits on the power of the crown. Though John almost immediately reneged on the deal, the Magna Carta would become a cornerstone of English law and a symbol of the fight against tyranny. But John's story doesn't end there. Determined to retake his lost lands in France, John launched a new campaign across the Channel. It was there, while pillaging his way through the Loire Valley, that John contracted dysentery. The evil shit, as one contemporary put it, would be the end of him. John died a miserable death, his body racked with fever and his bowels turning to water. It was an ignominious end for a king whose reign had brought England to the brink of ruin. John's failures as a ruler were manifold. He was cruel, reckless, and woefully inept at the art of kingship. Yet in a strange twist of fate, it was his very incompetence that led to the signing of the Magna Carta, a document that would shape the course of English history and inspire the cause of liberty for centuries to come. As we bid goodnight to bad King John, we're left to ponder the capricious nature of history. A terrible king, through his own failings, inadvertently planted the seeds of something great. It's a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of the past, there are glimmers of hope and progress. And with that thought, we'll let the sands of time carry us gently off to sleep. Speaking of dark chapters, the next king in our gallery of rogues is a figure cloaked in sinister legend. Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, is better known to history by his ominous nickname, Vlad the Impaler. His story takes us to the blood-soaked borderlands of Eastern Europe in the 15th century. Vlad was born into a noble family in Wallachia, a principality sandwiched between the Christian kingdoms of Hungary and Poland and the expanding Ottoman Empire. It was a precarious position, and one that required a ruler as ruthless as the enemies at his borders. In Vlad, Wallachia found a prince who was more than up to the task. From an early age, Vlad had known violence and brutality. As a child, he and his younger brother Radu were sent as hostages to the Ottoman court, a common practice at the time to ensure the loyalty of vassal states. There, Vlad witnessed firsthand the cruelty and casual bloodshed that was a part of Ottoman statecraft. When Vlad finally took the throne of Wallachia in 1456, he was determined to rule with an iron fist. He saw threats all around him, from the Ottomans, from rival noble families, and from anyone who dared to challenge his authority. And he met these threats with a singular brand of brutality that would make him a legend. Vlad's preferred method of execution was impalement, a slow, agonizing death that involved driving a sharpened stake through the victim's body. It was a punishment he meted out with terrifying enthusiasm, sometimes impaling hundreds or even thousands at a time. The sight of Vlad's so-called forests of impaled corpses became a grim warning to any who would cross him. But Vlad's cruelty wasn't just a means to an end. It seemed to be a perverse source of pleasure for him. He reportedly dined among his impaled victims, dipping his bread in their blood. He once had a group of beggars locked in a banquet hall and burned alive, saying he was freeing them from their misery. Even by the brutal standards of the time, Vlad's sadism was shocking. Yet for all his cruelty, Vlad was also a shrewd and capable ruler. He was a skilled warrior who won several key victories against the Ottomans, and he worked to strengthen Wallachia's defenses and centralize his own power. In a region beset by foreign invaders and internal strife, Vlad managed to keep Wallachia independent and secure, albeit at a terrible cost. Vlad's bloody reign finally came to an end in 1476 when he was killed in battle against the Ottomans. His head, so the story goes, was cut off and sent to Constantinople as a trophy. But even in death, Vlad's dark legend only grew. In the centuries that followed, he would become a figure of folklore and fantasy, the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula and countless other tales of horror. As we let the grim saga of Vlad the Impaler fade into the shadows of history, we're left to contemplate the nature of evil and the thin line between cruelty and necessity. In a time and place where violence was often the only currency of power, Vlad used it with a singular brutality that still has the power to shock and horrify us today. Yet his story also reminds us of the complex web of circumstances that can shape a tyrant, the harsh realities of a dangerous world, the traumas of a violent upbringing, the heavy burdens of rulership. With those sobering thoughts, we'll let the ghosts of the past recede into the mists of time and allow ourselves to drift into a hopefully more peaceful slumber. Good night, and may your dreams be gentler than the bloody nightmares of history. As we've seen, Ivan the Terrible's reign was a tumultuous and tragic chapter in Russian history. His early promise as a strong, reforming ruler gave way to paranoia, cruelty, and tyranny in his later years. The loss of his beloved wife, Anastasia Romanovna, seemed to unbalance Ivan, and he grew increasingly unstable and violent. The story goes that in 1565, Ivan formed the Oprichniki, his own loyal band of secret police, dressed in black and riding black horses. They carried out Ivan's will, terrorizing boyars and peasants alike, confiscating land and wealth for the Tsar. Towns that displeased Ivan, like Novgorod, were sacked mercilessly, the inhabitants tortured and killed in brutal purges. Most tragically of all, in 1581, Ivan's violent temper turned on his own family. The Tsar attacked his pregnant daughter-in-law, causing her to miscarry. When his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, confronted him about it, Ivan struck him on the head with his scepter in a fit of rage. The blow proved fatal. The young Tsarevich died a few days later, leaving Ivan shattered with remorse. The Tsar's physical and mental health declined sharply in his later years. He grew increasingly sick, suffering from excruciating pain and uncontrollable rages. Some historians believe he may have been poisoned, perhaps by one of the many enemies he had made. Isolated and paranoid, Ivan continued to lash out, even as his body weakened. According to legend, on March 18, 1584, Ivan was sitting down to a game of chess when he suddenly fell ill. The Tsar slumped over onto the chessboard, scattering the pieces onto the floor. Despite the best efforts of his doctors, he never regained consciousness. Ivan the Terrible, Tsar of all Russia, was dead at the age of 53. Ivan IV left behind a complicated legacy. He had expanded Russia's borders, strengthened the position of the Tsar, and instituted popular reforms in his early years. But his later descent into cruelty and madness cast a long shadow. The trauma of the Oprichnina and the years of terror would scar Russia for generations to come. Moving on to some other notably eccentric rulers, let's take a look at Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor from 1576 to 1612. Rudolf was a great patron of the arts and sciences, amassing an enormous collection of curiosities and treasures in his castle in Prague. But Rudolf was also a deeply troubled man. Intensely private and reclusive, he increasingly withdrew from the day-to-day business of ruling, preferring to spend his days among his collections. He suffered from bouts of severe depression and melancholy. and grew fixated on the occult, alchemy, and astrology. Most curiously, Rudolf became convinced that he was made of glass and could shatter at any moment. He took to wearing thick layers of padding under his clothes to protect his delicate glass body. Servants were ordered to whisper in the emperor's presence, lest their voices cause him to break. Rudolf's mental state continued to deteriorate in his later years. He flew into rages, talked to himself, and became increasingly paranoid. His behavior alienated his family and court, allowing his power to ebb away to his more able relatives. When Rudolf died in 1612, he left the empire in a state of crisis and upheaval. Across the continent in the Byzantine Empire, another ruler was grappling with madness in the 6th century AD. Justin II, who ruled from 565 to 578, was by all accounts a promising ruler at first, a skilled diplomat who secured peace with the Persians. But a few years into his reign, Justin's behavior took a bizarre turn. He began acting irrationally, not recognizing old friends and flying into wild rages. He alternately laughed and wept uncontrollably. He even took to barking like a dog during audiences, biting his attendants as they tried to restrain him. As Justin slipped deeper into insanity, the empire fell into disarray. The government ground to a halt, the army went unpaid, and the Avars and Slavs threatened the frontiers. Eventually, Justin's wife Sophia conspired with the ailing emperor's friend Tiberius to push Justin aside, ruling as his regents until his death in 578. Later, in 17th century Spain, the final Habsburg ruler Charles II earned the unflattering moniker the Bewitched. Born in 1661, Charles was the unfortunate product of generations of inbreeding among the Spanish Habsburgs who sought to keep their bloodline pure. As a result, Charles suffered a litany of physical and developmental disabilities. He didn't learn to walk until he was 8, or speak fully until 10. His tongue was so large he struggled to chew and speak. He suffered digestive problems and epileptic fits. Most tellingly, his Habsburg jaw was so pronounced he couldn't fully close his mouth. Charles's disabilities left him unable to rule effectively. He was a puppet for competing court factions, manipulated by those around him. When asked who should succeed him as his health failed, he allegedly replied, "I don't know. I'm only a fool." When Charles II died childless in 1700, he was the last of the Spanish Habsburg line. The question of his succession would spark a major European conflict, the War of the Spanish Succession. His death marked the end of an era for a dynasty plagued by the ill effects of inbreeding. As we've explored these stories of mad monarchs through the ages, a few themes emerge. The immense stress and pressure of ruling, often from a young age, took a toll on the mental health of many kings. In an age before mental illness was well understood, their erratic behavior could have devastating consequences for their realms. Their stories also highlight the importance medieval rulers placed on having a competent male heir. Without a clear line of succession, instability and power struggles often followed, as we saw with Charles the Mad's France or Henry VI England. Looking back with modern eyes, it's hard not to feel some sympathy for these tragic figures, grappling with inner demons in a very public role. While some like Ivan the Terrible used their power to lash out cruelly, others like Justin II and Charles II come across as sad cases, powerless against their afflictions. In the end, perhaps these mad monarchs are a reminder of the very human frailties of even the most powerful rulers. For all their wealth and status, kings were not immune to the same mental and physical illnesses that could strike down any medieval man or woman. As we finish our journey through these strange chapters of medieval history, I hope these stories of mad kings and ill-fated reigns have been an intriguing peek into the complex lives of rulers past, with just enough drama to keep you from nodding off completely. And with that, Our tour of eccentric sovereigns and medieval madness has reached its end. If you've enjoyed this bedtime foray into the annals of history, perhaps you'll join me again sometime. Please do like or subscribe if you'd care to hear more quirky tales of bygone days and long-dead kings, or if my droning on has proven a reliably soporific tonic. But for now, as the medieval world fades into the mists of dreams, I bid you good night and wish you a mercifully more peaceful and stable slumber than our poor mad monarchs. Sweet dreams.